Perfect. Thank you, Maggie. So welcome everybody to the series, Speaking Up for Point Molate. Pam, would you show the series announcement, please? In this series, invited speakers address key questions and issues about Point Molate, and members of the public can ask questions. But first, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement. We honor the Ohlone people for whom this area is home and who were the traditional stewards of this land. The descendants of the Ohlone live among us now, as documented by recent DNA studies, and they merit our respect for their culture and their ancestors. So in terms of an overview, the speaker will present for 30 to 40 minutes, and then will be available to answer questions. And we ask people to please limit their questions to 1 minute. But if you would like to raise more complex issues, please put them in the chat and we'll consider them for future presentations. And Point Molate has been kind of a contentious issue, especially in Richmond, so let's all be polite and courteous. And please use the chat to let us know how we can improve, or if you'd like us to contact you directly for future announcements, please leave your email, but everything that's in the chat will be part of the recording. This session and future sessions are going to be recorded and posted to a page that I'll copy into the chat in a second. So just a few introductions. I'm Sally Tobin. I'm a co-founder of this series with Pam Stello, who is handling arrangements tonight. Pam is co-founder of this series, and she's a member of the board of citizens for East Shore Parks and also I think co-chair, is that right, of the Point Molate Alliance. Maggie, our very able administrator who's managing the Zoom aspects of the call. Maggie has worked on the South Richmond Shoreline Community Action Group for many years, and she's also active in the Richmond Shoreline Alliance. So now I'll introduce our speaker, who is Glenn Phillips. He is a lifelong environmental educator and conservationist. He was raised in Livermore and got his start in environmental education by sharing his collection of reptiles and amphibians with local kindergarten classes, which must have been totally amazing. And Glenn has master's degrees in urban sustainability and science education, and is now back in the East Bay after years in New York City, where he was executive rector of New York City Audubon and vice president for education at Prospect Park. So I'm going to turn it over to Glenn.
Good evening, everybody. You would think that after 2 years of Zoom that we would have this down better, but we're having some Zoom issues, so we're going to go a little old-fashioned here, and someone else is going to be handling my presentation, so I'm going to be saying next slide a lot. This will just take us all back to those of us who are of a certain age, to those days when we had film strips that had to be manually advanced forward. So here comes our first slide. In just a second here. Now on my screen, I'm very big and my slides are very small, so maybe we want to remove spotlight on me and just to let my image be. But I am Glenn Phillips, as she said. I'm the executive director of Golden Gate Audubon. Golden Gate Audubon, for those of you who don't know us, we are one of the oldest Audubon organizations in the country. We're a little over 100 years old now, and we sort of predate the National Audubon Society. But we were founded in 1917 as the Audubon Society of the Pacific, and we have been promoting bird conservation in the Bay Area and beyond for that entire time. Next slide. So tonight, I'm obviously we're talking about Point Molate, and if you didn't know this already, there are a lot of birds at Point Molate. It's not just a kind of casual place for birds. There are quite a bunch there. Next slide, please. So as of today, we're up to 212 species that have been recorded as having been observed at Point Molate. Now the hotspot includes is a little bigger than just Point Molate. It goes all the way up to the edge of Point San Pablo. So it's sort of it's a little bit of a bigger area than just the core of Point Molate. But the birds move around, so it's not surprising that we would kind of see things in different parts of the area. Next slide. So in my description of the talk, I mentioned that the Point Molate sort of lies between the North Richmond shoreline and the East Shore Wetlands, which are the two major important bird areas. And I'll talk about what that means in a little bit. But there is a lot of good habitat in the North Richmond shoreline, and included within those 800 acres of mudflats are the mudflats of Point Molate. This is a really important site for birds on the northern half of San Francisco Bay. Next slide. If you're an expert birder, if you know all your birds, this talk probably isn't going to be for you. I'm sorry. There are 212 species. I can't possibly go into great detail on every single species that's present at Point Molate. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to focus on the groups of birds that depend on Point Molate, and to give you a sense of the breadth of importance of this place. So the first group of birds is I'm going to talk about our shorebirds. So these are obviously birds that spend their lives along the shores. Right? These are birds that have that generally forage between the high tide mark and the low tide mark, basically. Some of them will wade out a little bit further depending on the length of their legs. So you get birds like whimbrels and curlews that have longer legs, avocets, stilts that will go further out into the water. But mostly these are birds that are right along the edge of the shore. So the black oyster catcher, which is the bird on the left, that's a picture from Alan Krakauer. I'm sorry, I forgot to label who took. I don't have all the photographers' labels in yet. So the next time you see this, I'll fill in all those names. I'm incredibly grateful to the large number of photographers who have made it possible. Sorry, of course. Hold on. I'm sorry. My child is not. Has a tutor right now, and they're not in there with their tutor. I just need to remind them that they are supposed to be. Okay. There's a tremendous number of great photographs from great photographers. I'll try to point out some of the photographers here. So the black oyster catcher on the left is a shorebird that is here year round. They nest here. You can find them at any time of the year. These are really gregarious, really fun birds. They make a lot of noise. They're in pair bonds, and they are engaged with each other. They're really fun to watch. They have bright red bills and the overall black body, and they're big. They're like the size of a chicken. So they're fun to watch. They nest at Point Molate and around the bay. They like actually rocky shorelines is their favorite. And then we get shorebirds like the dunlin. That's the big cloud of birds that you see pictured on the upper right. The dunlin is a bird that tends to forage right along the tide. So as the waves come in, they're like sanderlings in that they will chase the waves back and forth a bit. They're a little bigger than a sanderling, sanderlings are the ones on the ocean beaches that chase the waves. These guys are a little bigger, so they often will actually be in the water a little bit, just on the edge of the water. And these are birds that are foraging in the mudflats, in the sandy beaches, looking for invertebrates. The bottom right, one of our larger shorebirds is a Dowager. All of these, there are about a dozen species that are regularly seen at Point Molate, and others that come and go that you might see in a maybe that are every few years you might get lucky and see one. So this is a big group of birds, and they can be very numerous. Dunlins, least sandpipers can be. There can be hundreds of them, thousands of them sometimes, all together. Next slide. So shorebirds are probably the most abundant group of birds that are seen at Point Molate, but the next group would be the waterfowl. So these are ducks and geese, and we get a lot of different species, and they are. It's interesting that because this is the bay, so we're mostly seeing sort of ducks we would call sea ducks. These are so the surf scoter on the upper right, a very handsome fellow. These are our birds that we see primarily. We get our waterfowl in the winter time. So these are birds that aren't nesting here necessarily, but they come, they hang out for the winter, and then they fly to the Arctic. On the left, which may be the single most abundant species are scaup, SCAUP, scaup. And there are two species, the greater scaup and the lesser scaup. And if you ever want to frustrate yourself, try and figure out which is which when you don't have both of them right next to each other. They're very similar looking birds, the greater scaup and the lesser scaup. They're about the same size. So the greater and lesser barely means a difference. It's the shape of the head is kind of the biggest the biggest thing. These are greater scaup, and they're more often greater scaup around Point Molate, but both species occur here. Next slide. So there's one more starting in the water. We're going to work our way inland. There's one other group of really important birds, which I'm calling nearshore water birds. These are birds like grebes, the three Clark's grebes at the top. There's another one, the Clark's grebe and the Western grebe look to an untrained eye look exactly the same. So I can tell these are Clark's grebe because if you zoom in on the eyes, you see the white goes over the eye. If the white was under the eye and it was black where the eyes are, then it would be a Western grebe. These are Clark's grebes. But from a distance, I have spent way too much time arguing with friends over, is that a Clark's grebe or a Western grebe? So it can be tricky to identify them. Below is a horned grebe. We actually have sort of Clark's grebes, Western grebes, horned grebes, eared grebes, pied-billed grebes. There are 5 grebes that we see right at Point Molate. So we see 5 grebes, and we have 3 loons. The bird on the bottom left is a Pacific loon. That's our most common loon. But we also have common loons and Arctic loons, and there's a 4th loon, a red-breasted loon. So there are lots of these. So these are not ducks, although they look a lot like ducks. And they can also congregate in large numbers. Again, these are birds that nest in the Arctic, although grebes will nest further south, but none of these birds nest at Point Molate. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to move my slide forward. No, next slide. One last group of water birds. This is sort of everything else. Some of the wading birds are pretty common at Point Molate. So the upper right-hand corner, that's a black-crowned night heron. We also have great egrets, snowy egrets, green herons are also. The black-crowned night heron is one of my favorites. They nest all over this region, and they often nest in really unfortunate places because they're not very particular compared to other egrets. They like to nest with their buddies. These are colonial nesters. they're not really so particular. So like one of our biggest nesting colonies around the bay is in downtown Oakland, right near the Oakland Museum, on a busy city street. This year, the Oakland Zoo actually has hired 2 people to monitor the nests and to collect any of the fledglings as they fall out of the trees, because that's what fledglings do. And in most places, they fall out of the tree and they're in a natural area, and it's not a big deal. They can hop into a bush and get out of the way. In downtown Oakland, there's no place for them to get out of the way. They end up on cars or under cars or on the sidewalk, and so they need rescuing. Fortunately, I don't know that there are any nesting at Point Molate, but there are lots of potentially good spots there. So if it hasn't happened, it might soon. In the bottom left is a double-crested cormorant doing what it loves to do best, which is catch fish. And it does not endear itself to fishermen for that habit. What's interesting is that that for the most part, it actually doesn't feed on commercial fish. A colleague of mine, who was an intern who worked with me in New York, did his PhD dissertation on looking at. So one of the interesting things about fish is that they have these weird little bones in their ears called otoliths that are distinct for each species. So you can just by this one little tiny bone, you can identify the whole species. And cormorants have this habit of regurgitating the fish parts that are not digestible. And they will particularly do it when they are scared. So if you're a researcher, that's good news, because what you do is you walk into a nesting colony of cormorants, and the birds regurgitate their last meal on top of you. And so you can easily collect it and then analyze the otoliths in it to see what they've been eating. And so it turns out they mostly don't eat the same things that we're trying to catch. And they mostly eat bonier fish that we tend to not be very interested in. So it turns out cormorants aren't actually the major cause of fish stock declines as some people worry that they are. The bird in between, this very handsome fellow, is a Pigeon Gilemont. And I think of Pigeon Gilemonts as being more open ocean birds. So when I first heard that people were seeing them at Point Molate, I was like, what are they doing there? But it all makes sense. All right. So turns out that Alcatraz is an important breeding site for Pigeon Gilemonts. And I imagine that Red Rocks is also, although I don't have any data to support that. I just would guess that they're probably there too. Pigeon Gilemonts they're kind of pigeon-sized seabird, and they are very handsome. They're black and white and red, and they nest in holes. So they don't nest out in the open the way most birds do. They dig tunnels, and they really like to use old tunnels that already exist, and so they're nesting on the islands in the bay, particularly rocky islands, and where else should they come to feed but at the most pristine eelgrass beds in the bay, right? I mean, the closest good eelgrass bed to Alcatraz is Point Molate. So it's really no surprise that all the cormorants, the loons, the grebes, there's no surprise that any of these fish-eating birds would be hanging out around Point Molate, because there's this tremendously rich food resource right there. It's critically important to their success. Next slide. When I was originally preparing, well, before I started to prepare for this talk, I looked at the important bird area report for the North Richmond Wetlands, and the report looked at sampled sites that were all north of Point Molate. So Point Molate wasn't included in that study, but the report makes a note of this North Richmond Wetlands. One of the things that made it special was that it was one of the first places in the bay where ospreys had returned to nest. And today, I think, I'd have to ask Tony how many nests we have this year, but a dozen, 20, 70. I mean, it's clear ospreys are doing well in Richmond. It seems like that is the center of abundance for ospreys around the San Francisco Bay, and probably because there was an early pair there, because it has great access to lots of different kinds of fish resources. Golden Gate Audubon runs an osprey cam. So if you haven't, it's not at Point Molate, but if you haven't looked at it, please do. It's pretty amazing. And it's run by this great group of volunteers. And one of the things that they've done is they have, it's a 20, all right, over 20. Thank you, Tony. Is they've actually really looked at what fish the ospreys are bringing back to the nest, and that's it's really exciting information, because you can from that information we've learned that they're bringing freshwater fish from San Pablo Reservoir, and near shore fish, and anadromous fish. That's like they are really getting a very interesting variety of fish. And I think that's part of why they've done so well in Point Molate, in that area, is that they're, because it's sort of at the confluence of the North Bay, San Pablo Bay, and the sort of the main open bay that the Central Bay, that we get a really, interesting collection of different kinds of fish resources that over a very long period that enable them to be really successful at raising young. But Point Molate isn't just about ospreys. At my last visit, there were nesting red-shouldered hawk. That's the second bird on the left, with that red on its shoulders, hence the name, red-shouldered hawk. And what was interesting, I put in, I was like, well, what's another? There are lots of other sort of more unusual raptors that make a stop at Point Molate at one time or another. There have been ferruginous hawk and Swainson's hawk, golden eagle, but the one that sort of I thought was sort of most exciting was that there have been a number of sightings of bald eagle of late, and of course there was over the weekend there was another sighting, and I'm grateful to Jeff for sharing his. So this is actually the osprey and the bald eagle in this slide are both actually photographs at Point Molate. So we have proof that they were there. Actually, in eBird, there are a lot of interesting examples of photographs of some of the more unusual raptors that have showed up at Point Molate, including burrowing owls and lots of other interesting species. So I'll share the access to the whole list in just a little bit. Next slide, sorry. One of the things that's really special to me about Point Molate is that it has, in addition to all of these really coastal resources, that there's this amazing, quite undisturbed upland. I mean, undisturbed is a relative term, right? I mean, there were fuel storage tanks and some buildings, and there's been plantings of non-native things, and invasive plants have disturbed, but still most of the site has not had houses built on it ever. So there's large spaces that have been not densely settled, and that's unique in that it's one of sort of the least settled corners of the bay. There aren't very many places around the bay where you can walk from the ocean shore as far as you can without encountering a house. And that really has created some opportunities. Even as there was human activity, there wasn't the same intensive activity that we have when we live places. And so that enables us to have a really interesting set of birds. So the first set are, I sort of purposely picked some kind of our less showy birds. So there are a lot of sort of kind of subtly gorgeous birds like chestnut-backed chickadee, the bushtit, and the California Towie. And don't let their plainness fool you. These are gorgeous birds. Like, take some time to look at them closely as they're, these are backyard birds. I have all 3 species in my backyard in Lafayette. They are, they're everywhere. I see them at our office in off of San Pablo Avenue in Berkeley. And they are really beautiful birds when you take the time to look at them carefully. But these are birds, and it's a big group of birds that just, they're here. I mean, they live here. They stay in the same territory their entire lives. The California Towie is a bird that's very tightly pair bound. So when you see one, you're going to see its partner pretty much seconds later. They don't tend to be more than about 20 feet apart ever. And when they're not in visual sight of each other, they're constantly making little twitter noises. They're chirping back and forth, so they know where they are. They don't like to be left alone. And so they're just like fun things that you can observe. And these birds they're everywhere in our communities. At the Oakland Christmas bird count had the highest density of California towies any place ever recorded. So these are birds that we see all the time. Bush tits, you don't see one bush tit, you see 8 or 16. We still don't really know why they tend to stay in these groups. Are they family groups? Are they groups of convenience? We don't really know. Next slide. So those are the birds. Oh, I have one more bird to add to our list of birds that are here year round. Of course, this is Anna's hummingbird. It's our most common hummingbird species, and it's abundant at Point Molate. I think when I was out there last time, I think we probably saw 20 of them without really looking for them. I mean, they actually really love the changes that humans have made to the environment, and this species is actually expanding its range and expanding its populations. That's a little unusual, but that's all right. We'll take them when we can get them. Next slide. So there's a second set of upland birds who, like the waterfowl, are really only here for the winter. These are, we think of birds fly south for the winter. Well, we're south for some of these birds. These 3 are particular favorites of mine. The Townsend's warbler in the upper right-hand corner is like, this is a showstopper bird. Anytime I can get people to see this bird, it's exciting, because this is a bird that you think of as, it's one of those birds that gets you excited. It's a warbler. We don't have as many here as they do back east. I was just talking to a friend who saw 17 species of warbler the other day before noon in Central Park. We get 5 or 6 species, but still they're every bit as spectacular as the ones they see elsewhere. On the far left is the ruby-crowned kinglet, and this is a bird, it never looks like this, I just promise you. I have seen them do this display with that ruby crown once. Most of the time, if they're not displaying, if they're not really agitated and defending their territory, that red is completely hidden and you can barely tell it. Like, if you really look closely, you can see a little hint of red on the top of its head. It completely hides it. So this looks like a little brown jobby, and they're teeny tiny birds. Honestly, this is the bird you look at when you were hoping for the Townsend's warbler. You saw a little movement at the top of the tree, like, it's a small bird, maybe it's a warbler. Oh no, it's a ruby-crowned kinglet. Oh well. But they're sweet. And these are birds that are only here in the winter. The last one, our most probably ubiquitous winter bird, the white-crowned sparrow. This is a bird that's sort of everywhere until suddenly it's gone. And there, a few will hang around, but they really don't breed here. They breed in the forests to the north of here, and so we lose them all. My father recently said, "Oh yeah, I know spring was over because the white crowns were all gone." That's in their backyard in Livermore. So this is another subset of birds. American pipit is a little teeny sparrow-like bird that hops along the ground. We'll see those at Point Molate. So there are birds who are depending on this habitat as a place to wait out the winter and forage. And build up their fat reserves so that they can make their migrations to the northern forests where they breed. Critically important, right? It's like birds need to be protected across their life cycle, right? It doesn't do to just protect their nesting area, doesn't do to just protect their wintering grounds. You have to protect both and in between. I'll see the next slide. So then there's another group of upland birds, and these are some of our prettiest ones that we are north. Right? These are birds that fly to Central and South America for the winter and come back here in the spring and to nest and raise their families. So the yellow warbler on the left, these yellow warblers tend to winter in Central America. So if you go to Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, you'll see them in abundance in the winter there, and then they thin out, and a few stay behind because why not? I mean, we think of these birds as we think our birds fly south for the winter, but that's really backwards, right? Really, these are their birds. These are tropical birds that fly north for the summer. Right? Their closest relatives tend to be other tropical species like orioles. We think of orioles like there are two main oriole species in the Bullock's oriole of the west and the Baltimore oriole of the east. And for a long time, people thought they were maybe one species because they interbred. And it turns out not only are they two separate species, they're not even the most closely related. Each one of them is more closely related to a South American species than they are to each other. So again, these are tropical birds that come north for the summer to breed. And so it's really important. They need open space. They need places where there aren't aren't pesticides being sprayed to kill the insects that they feed their young. They need where plant life is abundant, and the more native, the more better. The native plants have more insects on them than non-native plants, and they not only have more numbers, they have more diversity, and both things matter because baby birds, no matter what the parents eat, if these are upland birds now, forget the shorebirds, and right, they're a little different, but upland birds, baby birds eat caterpillars. That's it. The adults might eat fruits and seeds and flycatch, but baby birds get fed caterpillars by their parents. So if there are no caterpillars, there are no baby birds. Next slide. One last group, and this is the crazy stuff that makes birders go crazy. Birds are totally unpredictable. So birds that you would never expect to find in a particular place show up sometimes. Why? Well, sometimes it's because they've overshot. It's a more southerly bird, and it just kept going. It decided the winds were stronger than it realized. It flew further, and it overshot where it was going to go. Like the rock wren on the lower left. There's been a rock wren periodically at Point Molate. It's not totally out of its range, but they're usually a little south of here. This isn't sort of prime habitat for them. So it's sort of like probably an overshot. It was migrating. It just ended up at Point Molate instead of where it was usually headed. Sometimes they make a wrong turn. And it's not clear why. It may be related to artificial light at night. We know that can confuse the bird's sense of direction. Right? Most birds migrate at night, and even though we think of them as flying during the day and sleeping at night, because it's hard to see where you're going unless you're an owl. But at night, birds that migrate at night, and they are able to see the magnetic field basically, because they actually have magnetic particles in their eyes, but those particles are activated by light. So they need a certain amount of light in certain red wavelengths in order to trigger that sense. And if they get too much light, it goes haywire, and they can't see the magnetic field anymore, and they have no idea which way they're going, and they get lost. And so that can cause birds to get completely off course. So in the upper right is a black and white warbler. This is a warbler that migrates from Central America to the forests of the northeastern United States. One showed up at Point Molate. How did it get there? It definitely just went the wrong direction by a lot. The red crossbill in the upper left, I'm not sure what their story is, but they're again they're a forest bird. They like pine forests with lots of pine seeds for them to munch on. How it ended up at Point Molate, who knows? But it happens. They're one that are more regular. It's not so far out of their normal range. And then another crazy, the tufted duck is in the bottom right. A pretty unusual bird, but shows up here every now and then. We happen, Eurasian widgeon show up in the bay, not just at Point Molate, but at Point Molate also. Who knows how they ended up here, but they're not supposed to be here. I think that ends my survey of birds. Let's take the next slide. Skip that slide. That's from a different presentation. Sorry. There we go. This is the next slide that I was supposed to have. So I mentioned that that Point Molate is the transition between two important bird areas. And actually, so if we take the next slide. So what is an important bird area? Why do important bird areas matter? Sorry, I forgot which slide was next. Why do they matter? Well, because bird populations are declining. There are today 30% fewer birds than there were 50 years ago. That's a huge drop in the number of individual birds. That's across all species. There are 389 species in the United States that are vulnerable to climate change. And some of them, like California quail, will probably lose from the Bay Area because the conditions just aren't going to be right for them anymore. But they may have other places they can go. The other issue is that there are a lot of direct human threats. So that, windows, pesticides, the habitat loss, all of those things matter. And we're at a point where even last little bits of places like Point Molate really matter, because there aren't that many places left that aren't already protected. So if we lose places that still have good habitat but aren't actually protected, like there's no place to make that up, and we're already on the edge. So really, when we look at the biodiversity crisis and climate change, both, it's critically important that we not lose any more habitat. We're done. We've lost as much as we can afford to lose. We cannot afford to lose any more, or we'll lose everything. So now, when we want to develop more, we need to look at our previously developed places and develop them better. It is too late to create new. Next slide. All right, here's the slide that I was thinking was next. Important bird areas. The Important Bird Area Program is an Audubon program. So important bird area designation, and $5 will get you a cup of coffee. It's not really, it doesn't hold any regulatory weight. However, wildlife agencies pay attention to the work that Audubon has done over the last 100 years and more to protect birds. And so when Audubon says these places are really important, people stop and listen. And so in the state, so there are global important bird areas, there are national important bird areas, and then there are local important bird areas or state important bird areas. North Richmond Wetlands and the East Shore Wetlands are state important bird areas. And Audubon, California, which is National Audubon's California office, uses these criteria to determine what is an important bird area. So it's 1% of the global population of a species, or 10% of the state population of one or more sensitive species. In the case of the North Richmond IBA, that would include, there are actually a lot of species that fall in that. The Ridgway's rail was sort of the keynote species that we used for that determination. Ridgway's rails probably don't make it down to Point Molate much. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong about that. I don't see a lot of what looks like good ridgeway thrail habitat down at Point Molate, but that may not always be so. And certainly it's it lies in between in between better habitat for them north of there and better habitat of that south of there. So even if it's marginal habitat, it's an important part of the corridor between those two sites. Supporting more than 9 sensitive bird species, I think we've got about 20 sensitive bird species in Point Molate and across the North Richmond wetlands. 10,000 or more observable shorebirds, or 5,000 or more observable waterfowl. We get actually both. I think we've had 14,000 was the largest observable shorebird in a single day. It's pretty good, 14,000 birds. That actually happened further north. But the 5,000 or more observable waterfowl includes the bay of Point Molate, because that area is, again, the eelgrass beds there make it a prime fishing ground for birds, and we can have over 5,000 waterfowl out there in a single day, no problem. Next slide. So here's the map, and you can find this on Audubon California's website. Just Google important bird areas of California, or sorry, if you were, as my kids say, search it up. And so if you zoom in on this, you'll notice that actually, so even though all of our data none of our data included Point Molate in the North Richmond wetlands. On the map we did, and I don't know who was brilliant enough to do that. I decided that I don't have any data to support why I think this, but I think that because of that osprey nest, that was one of the species that's a sensitive species. So it was part of our 9 sensitive species was the osprey. And and at that time, the only osprey nests in that area were down on Point Molate. So that's my guess. So somebody had the brilliant idea to include that, even though basically all of our research was north of there, and there were no references to Point Molate in any of our research that determined this important bird area. But there you have it. Point Molate is part of an important bird area. It is critical habitat. As I said, it is primarily critical habitat because of its eelgrass beds, and because it provides that connectivity. It's really, the more habitat gets cut up into little pieces, by development, by piers, by all of the things that the human activity that disrupts the natural systems, the more those little patches in between become more important. Because otherwise we end up with these isolated areas, and without the connectivity, there are just many species that can't thrive. So Point Molate is even if it's not the best of the North Richmond wetlands habitat for some species, it's really important because it connects between better habitat patches that are adjacent to it. One more slide, I think. So how do I know what these birds are? Well, one of the reasons I know all of this is that eBird is, so for those who haven't used eBird, I strongly recommend that you take a look at it. eBird is a tool for tracking and recording bird sightings, and it has become a really important scientific research tool because there's just this sheer volume of information that has been collected on it. I think there are over 500 sightings, 500 reports for the Point Molate hotspot, and a smaller number from the Point Molate beach hotspot. And that's how things, so this is the Point Molate hotspot that I shared the link with. And you can really get a good sense of like, oh, these are all the birds that have been seen and by whom. So you can also find out like, who is it that's spending all their time bird watching at Point Molate? I know. If you want to get competitive, you can start tracking your own sightings, and you're both contributing to the scientific understanding of where birds are and how they're using our landscape. And it's kind of a fun sport for those of you if you're interested. I personally I would rather spend more time watching one bird than finding lots more. And so try eBird. And if you're newer to learning to identify birds, eBird is a project of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Merlin is their bird identification app, and it's really a lot of fun to use. It can identify birds from pictures. It can help you identify from field marks, and it can help you identify birds by sound, which is super exciting for me. I grew up with these birds, right? So once upon a time, I could have told you every bird that was singing, but I've been east for so long, I've completely forgotten all of that. So now I listen to something like, I know when I was 14, I knew that bird. Today, not so much. And so I've been really having a lot of fun sort of using it to sort of test myself. Although I put the Merlin sound app on, I turn it over so I'm not looking at it like, okay, that's a lesser goldfinch. Like, was I right? It can make it fun. It can, you can learn things. You can hear things that you didn't even notice were singing before. One more slide, and I'll take some questions before I run out of time. I'm probably already running out of time. I went over, sorry. What can you do to protect birds? One of the things that you can do is you can record your sightings. That using eBird, that data is really important to us and to science. That's how we know what's there. And the more you report, the more valuable your recordings become. It's the system sort of values people who submit regularly higher than people who are casual submitters. So it becomes more and more scientifically valuable the more you do it. You could join. So last year we had our first ever official Richmond Christmas bird count circle. Christmas bird count is a 110-year-old citizen science project, and it's actually a lot of fun. I participated in. Golden Gate Audubon runs 3 Christmas bird counts, one in San Francisco, one in Oakland, and one in Richmond. I did all 3 this year. It was really a lot of fun. It's a great chance to spend a nice cold winter day outdoors, in miserable weather, getting soaked. It's a lot of fun camaraderie. And again, this is the data that we use to say this is where birds are and why they're important. And it's how we track. We track what's happening with populations using this data. And of course, you could become a member of Golden Gate Audubon. We are the bird conservation group for the Bay Area. And although we're affiliated with National Audubon, our funding comes from our members, not from National Audubon. And so we encourage you to become members of Golden Gate Audubon and help support our conservation work. And now I'm ready for some questions.
Thank you, Glenn. That was wonderful. And thank you for introducing us to so many birds as if they were, old friends for whom you have a great deal of affection, as I'm sure you do. So Pam Stello will be handling questions from the audience. Pam? Pam, you're muted.
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Glenn. That was a wonderful presentation. Everyone, please raise your electronic hands and I can call on you if you'd like to ask a question, or I'll also look for questions in the chat, or also longer comments in the chat we would use to consider future presentations. So let me check now. Does anyone have a question? Okay, we have a question from Jim Hansen and then Jeannie Quartz. Thank you.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you. I was just curious, you mentioned some of the travel routes, some of these birds, and you mentioned South America and the Arctic. Could you give us an idea of the range? where some of these are landing, and
Yeah.
it's an amazing story.
So the Bay, San Francisco Bay is sort of kind of smack in the middle of what is called the Pacific Flyway. Now, the flyway concept is a little out of date these days. We now understand that the lighting has changed. The sun has just come in, so I'm now getting this glare. I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do about that. If I can move a little bit. Oh, there we go. That's better. So we're in the middle of the Pacific Flyway. Now, we know that birds actually aren't really following these exact paths, but generally speaking, it's a useful way to think about how birds move. And so the birds that we see in the Bay Area, sort of the most extreme would be birds that are coming from, South America. So like red knots, which actually are seen in the low thousands on the North Richmond watershore, mostly further east than Point Molate, but I know they have been seen at Point Molate. It's a declining and threatened bird, and they migrate from the beaches of southern South America and to Alaska. It's a huge trek, and now there are some that come up the Pacific Flyway, and there's some that do basically the same thing, but they go up the Atlantic shore and head up to breeding grounds in the Arctic on the Atlantic side. So we've got both, we've got birds that are doing that huge thing from one extreme to the other. Most birds don't do that, right? That's an extreme. So most birds are doing a kind of a mid-level hop. So birds like white-crowned sparrows can be there. They can range from they winter here in California, and they may winter from southern Oregon down to mid-Mexico. That'd be their winter range, and then they're going to breed from sort of northern California, the northern part of California, all the way up into almost to the Arctic Circle. Not quite. They're forest birds, so they go into the boreal forest, but they don't go beyond that. And it turns out that you would think that the northern bird, the birds that summer at the northern end of their range would winter at the northern edge of their winter range, but it doesn't work that way. They tend to hopscotch over. So the birds that are breeding at closest to the Arctic circle are actually flying the furthest. They actually winter further south. Our birds tend to summer sort of mid-range. So our birds tend to breed in Washington State and British Columbia, not all the way up. And then some of our, so each bird has its own story. And there's a Cornell Lab of Ornithology has a website called All About Birds, has a lot of really good information about the migratory pathways of these birds.
Thank you. Jeannie?
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. Excellent presentation. You had touched on how development is basically very bad for the birds, all different species of birds. And as you probably know, our mayor, Tom Budd, is hell-bent on having a big development at Point Molate, which would also, there would be problems with lighting. There would be problems with people with, gardens and fertilizer and pesticides and all that. I just wanted to ask you if you could touch a little more on this particular development, which would be right across from the Point Molate Beach Park. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there are a whole bunch of different possible concerns, right? Any development, as I said, it's like we're really at a point where we can't afford to lose any more open space. And so the impacts, the climate impacts alone are significant, right? So even if we didn't care about birds, there are plenty of reasons to not develop any undeveloped land anymore. the particular concern that I have about this particular spot is as you mentioned, that the eelgrass beds that lie up, and actually your background is kind of perfect. I don't know if everyone else sees it too, but sort of just to the right of your head is that bay is like, that's eelgrass beds. And though that eelgrass bed, you probably have heard this from somebody else, but we do eelgrass restoration projects in San Francisco, and so far we've failed every time we've tried. Doesn't mean we're not giving up yet. We're going to keep trying. And where does that eelgrass come from? It comes from Point Molate, right? That's because this is the most intact eelgrass bed in the bay. And why is it? I mean, it's in large part for the fact that the uplands have never really been significantly developed. So there's no runoff, there's no street runoff to speak of because there are hardly any streets there. There are no houses, there are no pesticides being applied on the hillsides. There's no herbicides being applied on the hillside. There's no fertilizers. There's no septic tank runoff. Like all of the things that development brings, that even in the best of management, which I mean, having grown up in a suburban, subdivision, I have no particular strong belief in the sterling qualities of developers who are trying to make a buck off of building homes, right? I mean, there were plenty of problems. I wouldn't trust anyone to not set us up for the catastrophic collapse of our eelgrass beds. I don't think it's really possible to avoid. And those eelgrass beds are critically important feeding habitat for wintering waterfowl. They are critically, the shoreline is critically important habitat for migrating shorebirds and resident shorebirds. And it's also a key piece in restoring eelgrass beds across the bay. So for all those reasons, it does not make any sense to me. The cost to our environment of this development would far outweigh any of the benefits that it would bring to our communities.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have one last question, Debbie Baer.
Thank you. I guess, maybe this is a question that can't be answered, but it goes along with what you've just been saying and with Jeannie's question, which is, you've been, working on these issues for a long time, and have you had any success in saving places? And because based on the critical nature of the habitat.
So I mean, yes, we've had a lot of, we remember our failures, certainly, and there have been more than I would like. But we do have a lot of successes. I would say that actually a significant portion of the North Richmond wetlands has entered into public ownership. In part, I mean, the Citizens for East Shore Parks have been the movers and shakers behind this. But having that the backing of Audubon's imprimatur of this is an important place for birds does carry weight for the East Bay Park District. They know where we've designated as important bird areas. When I meet with them, with their director of natural resources, he knows which places we're concerned about, and he knows what important bird areas are under his control, and there are a lot of them. And so I think that it has been helpful. I think that we have had, I feel like we have had some. I mean, I would say Golden Audubon's biggest success has been with, it's probably with Mono Lake. Where we were one of the leaders behind lawsuits to protect the watershed supply there. So I think it can work. I think that we have had, we've had some success in the Altamont, although we're not done yet. I do think there's hope. I think that particularly when we can build broader consortiums of people and get more different groups engaged in caring about places and speaking up for them, the more different groups we get, the stronger our voices become. And so I'm really sure that if we can keep engaging more and more people, that we will prevail.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sally? Oh, you're muted. Sally, you're muted.
All right, thank you very much, Glenn. That was wonderful. And I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to cover all the questions, but maybe you could put your question in the chat and we can certainly look for it later and see if we can figure out an answer. And thanks everybody for coming, and please tune in next week. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
I think if David's question was about South Shore Wetlands, yes, the South Richmond shoreline, that's the area that we call the East Shore Wetlands. So that would be the area from sort of south of, I can't think of the name of but the wetlands that border the Albany, and from Albany sort of north into Richmond. Those are also an important bird area, all the way south into to the Bay Bridge.